Hello everyone, this is Indian Standard Time, a brand new show from the stables of the Tribune that brings to you the most interesting story of the day, whether it's domestic politics, art, culture, or business, what India's thinking about the world and what the world is saying about India. Now, before I tell you about today's most interesting story, and I know you've guessed it, this is about America's Liberation Day, what America is saying about the world, the tariffs it's imposing upon the world, not just on India. Before I talk to you about that, dear viewer, I'd like to request you to click on the subscribe button, to follow the YouTube channel of the Tribune, to follow this show, Indian Standard Time, and all our other shows from the Tribune. And do tell us what you think of all the work that we do right here on the Tribune. Now, today's story is about Donald Trump, America's president. Within the first 3 months of his becoming president, he's unveiled this incredible initiative move from his government. He called it the Liberation Day of for all of America. And by that, what he's done is he's imposed a flat 10% trade tariff on all the countries of the world, whether it's tiny Solomon Islands, whether it's his neighbor, Canada. China, of course, is bearing the brunt of the tariffs. Its own ally, the UK, 10%, European Union, 20%, India is 27%, and we'll go into that a little bit later. And perhaps I should just give you a list of some of the other more interesting nations. Let me just read them out to you. Like I just said, China is 34%, the UK 10%. Japan, an ally of the US, is 24%. South Korea, another ally, 25%. Taiwan, 32%. And remember, when Taiwan is not just one of the US's closest allies, but it has been over the last several decades in the wake of the People's Republic, mainland China becoming a communist nation. Taiwan has been treated by the Americans as more than an ally in many ways. But Donald Trump really doesn't care, dear viewer. He's imposed a 32% trade tariff on Taiwan. Vietnam has 46%, an incredible 46%. Back here in South Asia, like I said to you, India is 27%. Bangladesh, 37%. This is going to impact Bangladesh's textile and garments industry hugely. Pakistan, 29%, and Sri Lanka, a whopping 44%. The Sri Lankans are really depressed about this move. Guess what? One country on which Donald Trump has not imposed any tariff. Can you take a guess, dear viewer? You're right, it's Russia. And the reason that he says that there has been absolutely no tariff on Russia, it's because, and you know, why has Russia been spared? Because his Treasury Secretary, the US Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, told Fox News that Moscow has already been so badly affected by the war with Ukraine. And as we all know, dear viewer, that the Americans have been trying very hard to broker a ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine these last few weeks. As for India, like I said, the Americans have imposed a 27% tariff on India. The Indians are taking a deep breath. They haven't said very much. Commerce Ministry officials are describing it as a mixed bag, which is a good thing. The Indians are not reacting so far. They hope that the bilateral trade negotiations between India and the US that have been ongoing for some time, hopefully they will be completed over the next few months. So perhaps India is baiting the Americans into saying that we will do a deal, we will do a goods and trade negotiation with you, and that's when we can talk about every product under the sun. For the time being, Donald Trump, in his very expansive manner at the White House this morning, and you can see some of the pictures. He walks out in his, and it's still cold in America, right? So he walks out of the White House, and there in front of on like a veranda type of place, there's a table over there, and he sits down and he announces this. He's got a huge board. It's almost like a blackboard on which you sort of write various things, and every country the tariff imposed, the import tariff from that country into America and vice versa. It's all there. And this is what he says about India. And he says, India, very, very tough, very, very tough. The Prime Minister just left. He's a great friend of mine. But I said, you're a friend of mine, but you're not treating us right. India charges us 52%. You have to understand, we charge them almost nothing for years and years and decades. And it was only 7 years ago when I came in that we started with China. So Trump begins his comment on India and then moves into China. And perhaps, dear viewer, that's what it's all about. The Americans know, Donald Trump knows, that the only country in the world that is within snapping distance of America's superpower status, one country in the world, China. And this is communist China, the People's Republic. If you remember, go back into your history books, became independent in 1949. Remember, India becomes independent in 1947, only 2 years apart. When the Long March ends and Mao Zedong's Red Army comes to Beijing after many, many months of walking across the length and breadth of China, comes to Beijing, which is where the story ends and a new chapter of China begins. 1949 China, 1947 India. But look at the big distance between the two. China's economy today is 5 times larger than India. Of course, you will argue, dear viewer, that the Chinese are communists and the Indians are Democrats, and you will be absolutely 100% right. There's a huge difference in a socioeconomic, the manner in which India has chosen to be a democracy after partition, after the Second World War, forced the British to give up India, the jewel of its empire. 1947, India becomes independent, and India chooses to be a democracy. China, on the other hand, a completely different manner of governance that it chooses, communism. And since then, nearly 80 years later, this is where we are today. China, a much stronger economy, but India, a much, much stronger nation in terms of its democracy. But guess what? Look at the way the politics in the world have evolved. Today, the Americans, the only superpower in the world, admittedly, the world is a multipolar world today, not a you don't have the two superpowers like you did back in the day between the former Soviet Union and America up to 1991, when, as you know, the Soviet Union collapsed. Today, if there is one country that is challenging the Americans, that's China. And Donald Trump, the President of the United States, recognizes that. Which is why, in a sense, this whole tariff regime has come into play. Now, a lot of economists, including Professor Jyoti Ghosh, formerly of Jawaharlal Nehru University and latterly with the Amherst School in Massachusetts in the US, says that this is going to create a huge deal of uncertainty, chaos in the world. Other people across the European Union have also described Trump's tariff regime in similarly dark ways. But the question is, why have the Americans done this? And I come back to one word, China. Trump knows that the Chinese have built their economy in the last 40 or so years since Deng Xiaoping in 1978 became the General Secretary of the Communist Party of China, that it is on the basis of American hunger for cheap goods, for cheap Chinese goods, which is why a lot of Chinese investors moved factories, lock, stock and barrel, into China. That gave the Chinese economy a big fillip. It helped the Chinese to produce cheap goods, not just cheap, but also of good quality, which were then manufactured in China and re-exported back to the US. It is on this pattern that the Chinese economy has been built. And today Donald Trump is saying that if it's on America's money, on America's insatiable appetite, hunger for these cheap Chinese low-cost goods, why isn't it that we can reverse the tide and get some of those jobs that the Americans have outsourced to China, why isn't it that we can get them back into the US, especially if US unemployment is growing? That's what Donald Trump is bargaining, is that he will be able to wean America away from this dependence on cheap goods coming from China. In turn, the bargain that he's offering America is that, yes, there will be some pain in the short term, but then this will bring jobs back into the US economy, which is why even allies like the UK, Canada, Mexico, the European Union has a 20% tariff imposed on its goods. It's making a lot of the countries in the European Union across the continent, including countries like France, which is a permanent 5 member in the UN Security Council, one of the 5 countries, as you know, which is a nuclear weapons nation very close to the Americans. The French are really upset today. So is Giorgia Meloni, the Prime Minister of Italy. And remember, Ms. Meloni is also very close to Prime Minister Narendra Modi. So if the Europeans are unhappy about this tariff that has been imposed by the Americans, the Chinese, of course, are very unhappy, and they're calling it a bullying on the part of the Americans. That is understandable, that the Chinese will reciprocate. Not just reciprocate, they're going to retaliate. And that's when the fear in the world, including what Professor Jyoti Ghosh talks about, is that there could be, if a trade war unfolds, a global trade war, that is going to create its own level of uncertainty that is completely, that nobody knows today, that nobody can predict today. But this level of uncertainty, if we just describe it a little bit for you, dear viewer, I was talking to you about the Europeans a minute ago. The French, for example, and by the way, the tax on France, on the European Union, which is about 20%, Donald Trump has not imposed the 200% tax on champagne, which he had promised to do some time ago. But Italy, Giorgia Meloni, very unhappy because this 20% tax is going to have a huge impact on the liters and thousands of liters of wine, for example, that Italy exports to the US. So what's the moral of the story? That America is a huge market for the world, that America's tariffs for this world market are much lower than the tariffs that these nations impose on American goods, including by the Canadians, by the way, and the US and Canada share this very close brother or sister relationship. The Canadians, for example, impose a 300% tax or duty on American butter and cheese. Certainly that's something that Donald Trump doesn't like. So if you look at the upside, then perhaps this move by Donald Trump is not just going to, in his eyes at least, and for the moment, it's going to make the world a more fair place, a more sort of fair trading could take place. On the other hand, as a lot of other people are saying, including Professor Jyoti Ghosh, this could become the recipe or could be an ingredient for a global trade war and perhaps uncertainty that nobody can not just predict, but nobody will be able to deal with. So let's come to India, and I've put my glasses on so you know that I'm going to read a little bit from the notes that I've made. The India-US relationship is a very interesting one. The US is India's largest trading partner. It accounts for about 18% of India's exports. And what that means is that there is a trade deficit of $46 billion with India, which means that this trade deficit is in favor of the US. If that sounds a bit complicated, in simple terms, what that means, dear viewer, is that India earns $45 billion more than the US does, which is so different from what the US does with a lot of the other countries. For example, with China, where there is nearly a $300 billion trade deficit with China. Now, just a few figures, dear viewer, for you. $87 billion worth of exports from India to the US and $42 billion worth of imports from the US into India. So that leaves about, $45 billion or so in favor of India. Interestingly, in this Trump tariff deal, this new regime that has been put into place, India's generic drugs have been exempted, and India exports about $9 billion worth of generic drugs to the US. And perhaps one of the reasons it's been exempted is because, not just perhaps because of the lobbying that the Indian pharma industry must have done with the Americans, but also because these drugs are so cheap. And if you compare them with the other drugs that the Americans manufacture or import, the ingredients for these drugs from other parts of the world, notably from China, then they are far more expensive to manufacture. And that's another very interesting point, which is that the Chinese actually manufacture the ingredients for a large number of these drugs. In fact, India's pharma industry is also dependent hugely on Chinese ingredients for these drugs. Now, back to the India-US story for a moment. The Americans are arguing that the US imposes only a 2.5% tariff on passenger vehicle imports, but India imposes a 70% tariff. Apples are allowed to enter the US duty-free, but India imposes a 50% duty on American apples. And as far as rice is concerned, which is a big product that India exports, the rice attracts only 2.7% tariff in the US, but India charges America 80% for all imported rice. Now, what does all this mean? What it means, dear viewer, is the following, and I'm going to make 3 points. The first is that there has been a lot of concern these past few weeks since Donald Trump announced a few weeks ago that this is what he was going to do. There have been a lot of conversation between the Indians and the Americans. Both governments have been going back and forth talking about the kind of deal that they could be cutting that would be fair to both sides. Now, the interesting thing about this deal is that the Modi government is very aware that its core political support comes from the kirane ki dukaan, the small and medium enterprise. If you open your economy to American goods, not just to cheap Chinese goods, then then these Indian small and medium manufacturers or enterprises may be in danger of being wiped out. But what does that mean, dear viewer? What that means is that these Indian small and medium enterprises are actually not competitive. They're not, their wages are low, productivity is low, and that means that they're not competitive. So how do you answer this conundrum? In the short term, what the Modi government could be trying to do, and that's perhaps one of the elements of its strategy in dealing with the US, is to push the ball down the road. And by that, what I mean is that they're telling the Americans that, yes, we will talk to you about imposing that, and we will open up the market to you. But you have to give us time. So I think there will be a plan between the two governments where they will India will open the economy, reduce its tariffs, allow American goods to come in. And that will force the Indian economy, these self-same small and medium enterprises, to become far more competitive. Could this be, dear viewer, another 1991 moment? Many of you were not born in 1991. Many of you may have been too young to remember what happened in 1991. But those of you old enough to remember know that it was when the P.V. Narasimha Rao government with Dr. Manmohan Singh, then as his finance minister, opened India to the world. India was more or less a closed economy at the time, a mixed economy at best, opened India to the world, and that forced India to unveil an economic reform on which it has been riding for the last 40 years or ever since. Of course, there have been other reforms in this meantime as well. Could 2025 become a second part or part two of the 1991 reform? That's the hope. So back to Indian Standard Time, dear viewer. I hope you have enjoyed me telling you about this story of the India-US economic relationship. There's a lot more to come, of course, so watch me over the next few days as we talk about this story and many others. Remember, on Indian Standard Time, it's always the most interesting story of the day. I'm Jyoti Malhotra for the Tribune.